This is based on a true story. Names, places, and dates have been modified. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet streets of the city. In a small apartment on the outskirts, a man sat by the window, his gaze lost in the distant skyline. His eyes, once bright with youthful dreams, now held a profound sadness, a deep well of unfulfilled longing. The apartment was a modest one-bedroom, filled with remnants of a life lived in quiet solitude. Framed photographs of distant relatives and scenic landscapes adorned the walls, yet none captured the essence of his true memories. The furniture was simple, functional, and well-worn, reflecting a man who found little joy in material possessions. The only items that seemed to be meticulously cared for were an old leather-bound journal and a stack of weathered envelopes tied together with a frayed ribbon. He reached into the drawer of his oak writing desk and pulled out one of those envelopes. Inside were letters, yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded but the words still vivid, etched into his memory. Each letter was a piece of his heart, a fragment of a love that had endured the test of time and distance. As he unfolded the first letter, he could almost hear her voice, soft and melodic, reading the words aloud. Her laughter, her smiles, her tears, they were all there, encapsulated in those fragile sheets of paper. He closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him, transporting him back to a time when love seemed possible, when dreams had yet to be shattered. In those days, he was a young boy, full of hope and innocence, living in a world that did not understand the language of the heart. He had seen her just once, and that fleeting glimpse had changed everything. She was like a ray of sunlight piercing through the clouds, illuminating his soul with a light that had never dimmed. The memory was as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. He had been at a family gathering, a typical event filled with the laughter and chatter of relatives and friends. And then he saw her. She stood across the courtyard, her long dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her eyes sparkling with an inner light. She was talking with some other girls, and when she laughed, it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. In that instant, he knew that his life would never be the same. Their love story began in the shadows, hidden from the prying eyes of their families and society. They exchanged secret letters, passing them in the hidden crevices of the workplace where they both ended up employed. Each note, each small token of affection was a lifeline that connected their hearts, even when they were apart. Every morning, the first thing he did was look for her letter. They had a hidden spot in the office, a tiny crack behind the supply closet where they exchanged their messages. Her handwriting, delicate and flowing, was like a balm to his soul. Each word she wrote, every little doodle in the margins, he cherished more than anything in the world. He would read her letters over and over, each time feeling closer to her, despite the physical distance they had to maintain. Their relationship grew, and with it, their hope that one day they might be together openly. Their families began to notice, and for a time it seemed they might have their blessing. But fate had other plans. His father, bound by the rigid norms of their culture, could not accept what he saw as an affront to his authority. The confrontation was inevitable and devastating. His father's anger was a storm that swept through their home. The night he confronted him, his words cut deeper than any blade. "Do you want that girl?" he shouted, his face red with fury. He stood there, unable to speak, his heart pounding in his chest. "If yes, then you are disowned. Go and live with them. You are not my son anymore." His words echoed in his ears as they drove to her house, his mother silent and tearful beside him. When they arrived, her parents refused to let them in. Her mother's slap burned on his cheek, her words colder than ice. "Do you want to marry her or not?" she demanded. He could only whisper, "I obey my parents," before the door slammed shut, severing the fragile thread of their love. The aftermath was a blur of grief and confusion. Her father's sudden death, the shattered dreams, and the unbearable silence that followed. The military provided an escape, but it could not heal the wounds. Training was grueling, but it was nothing compared to the torment of his heart. Each day was a battle, not just for survival, but against the urge to end his suffering permanently. Years passed, and the world moved on, but he remained tethered to the past. He heard that she and her family had left the country, a final blow to his hopes of reconciliation. Life in the USA offered a chance to start anew, but it was a hollow existence. He worked, he lived, but he did not truly live. His nights were filled with dreams of her, and his days were a monotonous march through an endless gray. Then came the day he found her wedding photos online. She was in a beautiful white dress, her smile radiant yet tinged with an unspoken sorrow. He could see the pain in her eyes, the same pain that haunted his own. She was married, and any lingering hope he had was crushed. Yet he could not bring himself to hate her new life. All he wanted was for her to be happy, even if it meant he would never be a part of it. Almost 3 decades had passed since that fateful night, but his love for her remained undiminished. It was a love that transcended time and space, a love that defined his existence. His therapist suggested seeking closure, but he knew he could never risk causing her more pain. His love had always been about her happiness, even if it meant sacrificing his own. Now, as the last light of day faded and the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, he knew that his love for her was eternal. It was a love that transcended time and space, a love that would remain with him until his last breath. Holding the letter close to his heart, he whispered a silent prayer for her happiness, wherever she might be. And in that moment he found a semblance of peace, knowing that true love, though often fraught with pain, is a gift that never fades.
Chapter 1. First Sight. The year was 1985, a time when the world seemed full of possibilities, yet bound by the rigid traditions and expectations of his culture. The protagonist, a 16-year-old boy named Amir, was attending a family gathering at his uncle's house. The courtyard was filled with the chatter of relatives and the aroma of rich, traditional foods. Children ran around playing games while adults engaged in animated conversations. Amir felt a sense of detachment from the lively scene. He was a quiet, introspective boy, more comfortable with books than with social gatherings. He wandered to the edge of the courtyard, seeking a moment of solitude, and that's when he saw her. She was standing across the courtyard, partially hidden by a group of girls her age. Her name, he would later learn, was Layla. She had a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. Her long, dark hair cascaded over her shoulders in soft waves, and her eyes, dark, soulful, and incredibly expressive, seemed to hold secrets and stories untold. Amir's breath caught in his throat as he watched her. She was laughing at something one of her friends had said, a melodic sound that seemed to pierce through the noise of the gathering and reach straight to his heart. Her smile was radiant, lighting up her face and making her beauty even more striking. She was tall and graceful, moving with an elegance that belied her youth. For a moment, everything else faded away. The bustling courtyard, the chatter, the laughter of others, all of it became a distant hum. All Amir could see was Layla. His heart pounded in his chest, a strange mixture of excitement and fear. He knew even in that brief moment that she was different from anyone he had ever met. She was someone special, someone who would change his life forever. Their eyes met across the courtyard. It was only for a second, but it felt like an eternity. Layla's gaze was curious, kind, and perhaps a little amused by the intensity with which he was staring at her. Amir quickly looked away, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. He tried to compose himself, but his mind was racing. Who was this girl who had captured his heart so effortlessly? As the evening wore on, Amir found himself constantly glancing in her direction, stealing furtive looks whenever he thought no one was watching. He noticed the way she interacted with others, her kindness, her intelligence, the way she made everyone around her feel at ease. She was not just beautiful on the outside, there was a depth to her, a warmth that drew people in. When it was time for the families to leave, Amir felt a pang of disappointment. He hadn't even spoken to her, hadn't had the chance to know her. Yet he knew that this brief encounter had changed him. As he walked back to his family's car, he turned for one last look at Layla. She was standing with her parents, her smile still radiant. Their eyes met once more, and this time she gave him a small, shy smile. That smile stayed with Amir long after they had driven away. It was etched into his memory, a beacon of hope and possibility. He knew with a certainty that belied his years that he had to see her again. That night he lay awake in bed, replaying the encounter over and over in his mind. He whispered a silent prayer, asking for a chance to know her, to be with her. From that day on, Layla was never far from his thoughts. He carried her memory with him, a secret treasure that he guarded jealously. In a world that often seemed dark and confining, she was a light, a promise of something more. And so began Amir's journey, a journey that would be marked by love and longing, by hope and heartbreak, a journey that would define his life and shape his destiny.
Chapter 2. Unseen Prayers. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Life carried on in its usual predictable manner, but for Amir, everything had changed. Layla's image was a constant presence in his mind, a source of both joy and torment. He would see her face in his dreams, hear her laughter in the quiet moments, and feel her absence like a physical ache. Amir's family lived in a different part of the city, far enough that their paths rarely crossed. But distance did nothing to diminish his feelings for her. Each night he would lie awake, whispering prayers into the darkness. He prayed for a chance to see her again, for her to feel the same way about him. He prayed for a miracle in a world where such things seemed impossible. The cultural norms and expectations of their society loomed large over his dreams. Relationships between boys and girls were strictly controlled, with any form of romantic involvement needing the explicit approval of their parents. The idea of an arranged marriage was deeply ingrained, leaving little room for personal choice or affection. Amir knew that pursuing his feelings for Layla openly would invite scandal and disapproval. But his heart knew no such boundaries. Despite the rigid rules, despite the overwhelming odds, he held on to his love for Layla. It was a love that defied reason, a love that sustained him through the mundane routines of daily life. He found solace in the hope that somehow their paths would cross again. One afternoon, as he was returning home from school, he spotted a familiar figure in the marketplace. His heart leapt as he realized it was Layla, accompanied by her mother and younger brother. She was browsing through a stall, examining colorful scarves. Amir hesitated, his pulse quickening. This was the moment he had prayed for. But now that it was here, he felt paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. Gathering his courage, he approached the stall, pretending to be interested in the items on display. His eyes darted to Layla, who was engrossed in her selection. She looked up, and for a moment their eyes met. Recognition flickered in her gaze, followed by a warm smile. Amir's heart soared. "Hello," he managed to say, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Hello," Layla replied, her smile widening. There was a moment of awkward silence, filled with the unspoken connection between them. "Do you like these scarves?" Amir asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "They're beautiful," she said, holding up a deep blue scarf with intricate patterns. "My mother is helping me choose one." Amir nodded, feeling a rush of happiness just from speaking with her. "I think this one suits you," he said, pointing to the scarf in her hand. Layla's cheeks flushed slightly as she looked at the scarf, then back at him. "Thank you," she said softly. Their brief conversation was interrupted by her mother, who beckoned her to move on to another stall. Layla gave Amir one last smile before following her family. As Amir watched her walk away, he felt a mixture of exhilaration and longing. Their encounter had been brief, but it was enough to rekindle his hopes. He knew that their love would have to navigate the harsh realities of their world, but he was willing to fight for it. For now, he would continue his unseen prayers, holding on to the belief that one day they would find a way to be together. And so, the days passed, filled with the silent yearning of a young heart. Amir continued to pray, to dream, and to hold on to the memory of Layla. Little did he know that fate had already begun to weave its intricate patterns, bringing them closer to each other in ways they could never have anticipated.
Chapter 3. Serendipity at Work. 3 years had passed since that fateful first encounter. Amir was now 19, having just graduated from high school and eager to embark on the next chapter of his life. He had secured a job at a local company, a position that promised stability and a modest income. Though his days were filled with work and new responsibilities, his heart still ached for Layla. On his first day at the company, Amir arrived early, nervous but determined to make a good impression. The office buzzed with activity as employees went about their tasks, phones ringing and keyboards clicking. He was introduced to his new colleagues, shaking hands and exchanging polite greetings. The office manager, a kind but stern woman named Mrs. Jalal, showed him to his desk and handed him a stack of papers to review. As Amir settled into his new role, he couldn't help but feel a sense of disconnection. The work was straightforward, but his mind frequently wandered to thoughts of Layla. He often wondered where she was, what she was doing, and whether she ever thought of him. During a break, Amir decided to explore the office, hoping to familiarize himself with his new environment. He wandered through the corridors, passing by various departments and peeking into conference rooms. As he turned a corner, he heard a familiar voice, a voice that had haunted his dreams for years. His heart skipped a beat as he followed the sound. There, in the reception area, stood Layla. She was talking to Mrs. Jalal, her back turned to Amir. His breath caught in his throat as he took in the sight of her. She looked just as he remembered, her elegance and grace undiminished by the passage of time. Mrs. Jalal noticed Amir and beckoned him over. "Amir, come here. I'd like you to meet our new secretary, Layla." Layla turned and their eyes met. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Layla's eyes widened in recognition and a smile spread across her face. "Hello, Amir," she said, her voice warm and friendly. "Hello, Layla," Amir replied, his heart pounding. "It's been a long time." Mrs. Jalal looked between them, sensing the connection. "It seems you two already know each other," she remarked with a knowing smile. "That's good. It'll make the transition easier." As Mrs. Jalal walked away, Amir and Layla stood there, both overwhelmed by the unexpected reunion. They exchanged pleasantries, each trying to mask their excitement and nervousness. Layla explained that she had recently started working at the company and was still settling into her role. Throughout the day, Amir found himself stealing glances at Layla, marveling at the coincidence that had brought them together again. He felt a renewed sense of hope and determination. This time he wouldn't let fate slip through his fingers. As days turned into weeks, Amir and Layla's friendship grew. They would exchange smiles and brief conversations during office hours, careful not to draw too much attention to themselves. It wasn't long before they began to find ways to spend more time together. They discovered a hidden corner of the office, a small storage room that had fallen into disuse. It became their secret haven, a place where they could talk freely and exchange letters without fear of being caught. Each morning, Amir would leave a note for Layla in their secret spot, and she would respond with one of her own. Their notes were filled with affection, dreams, and plans for a future they hoped to share. The stolen moments they spent together in that little room became the highlight of Amir's days, a source of joy and excitement that kept him going. Their love, though hidden, blossomed in the confines of the office. They shared their hopes, fears, and dreams, building a bond that grew stronger with each passing day. Layla's presence brought a light to Amir's life that he hadn't felt in years. He found himself looking forward to each day with a renewed sense of purpose. One evening, as Amir was getting ready to leave the office, he saw Layla waiting for him by the entrance. She looked around nervously before approaching him. "Amir, can you give me a ride home today?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Amir's heart raced. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. "Of course," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'd be happy to." As they drove through the quiet streets, the air between them was charged with unspoken emotions. Layla glanced at Amir, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper. "Thank you, Amir," she said softly, "for everything." Amir smiled, his heart swelling with happiness. "Anything for you, Layla." Their secret rides home became a regular occurrence, each journey bringing them closer together. They would talk about their day, their dreams, and their plans for the future. For those brief moments, it felt as if they were the only two people in the world. One evening, as they neared Layla's house, she reached over and gently touched Amir's hand. "I wish the road would never end," she whispered, her voice filled with longing. Amir's heart ached with the intensity of his feelings. "So do I," he replied, his voice choked with emotion. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their unspoken words hanging in the air. Then Layla leaned over and kissed Amir on the cheek, a tender, fleeting gesture that spoke volumes. "Good night, Amir," she said softly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Good night, Layla," he replied, watching as she disappeared into the house. As Amir drove away, his heart was filled with a mixture of joy and sorrow. He knew that their love would continue to face obstacles, but he was determined to fight for it, no matter the cost. For the first time in his life, he felt a sense of hope and purpose, driven by the love he had found and the future he dreamed of with Layla. To be continued. Don't forget to subscribe to hear the rest of this story.